The first thing the HOA president said to me was, "You have exactly 48 hours to remove that dock from our lake, or we'll remove it for you." She didn't even introduce herself, just marched straight down my gravel driveway like she owned the place, heels crunching against the stones, a clipboard clutched in one hand, and a line of angry neighbors following behind her like some kind of suburban army. I had been living at the lake house for less than 12 hours. My moving truck was still parked beside the garage. Half my furniture was still wrapped in plastic. And now suddenly there were 9 strangers standing on my property, glaring at me like I'd just committed a crime. The woman at the front looked to be in her late 50s, perfectly styled silver hair, sunglasses bigger than necessary, the kind that scream authority complex. She smelled like expensive perfume and irritation. She tapped the clipboard hard. "You must be the new owner," she said. Marcus Hale. Not a question. A statement. I wiped lake water off my hands. I'd been testing the dock ladder when they arrived. "Yeah," I said slowly. "That's me." She nodded toward the wooden dock stretching 20 feet into the water. "That structure violates 3 separate HOA regulations. It's unauthorized, unapproved, and obstructs community lake access." I blinked. Community lake. A murmur ran through the neighbors behind her. A tall guy in a golf shirt crossed his arms. A woman with a tiny dog shook her head dramatically. The HOA president sighed like she was explaining basic math to a child. "This lake," she said, sweeping her arm across the calm blue water, "belongs to the residents of Pine Harbor community." Then she jabbed a finger toward my dock again. "And that means you do not get to build whatever you want on it." The thing was, I hadn't built it. The dock was already here when I bought the property. Old cedar planks, weathered but solid, stretching out over the water like it had been part of the shoreline for decades. I pointed at it. That dock came with the house. She smiled, not a friendly smile. The kind that means you're about to learn a lesson. Not anymore. She flipped a page on the clipboard and started reading like a courtroom clerk. According to Pine Harbor HOA bylaws, Section 14.2, any private structures extending into community-controlled water must be approved by the board. Another page flip. You failed to submit a dock application. A third page flip. Therefore, you are currently in violation. Behind her, someone muttered, "Typical." Another voice said, "They always think the rules don't apply to them." I looked from face to face. None of them looked friendly. In fact, several looked like they had been waiting for this moment. Like I'd just stepped into some kind of neighborhood courtroom. The president checked her watch dramatically. "You have 48 hours to remove the dock," she repeated. "Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $500. She paused for effect, "and potential legal action." Someone behind her added helpfully, "plus enforcement fees." Another neighbor nodded. "Could go into the thousands." The lake behind them rippled softly in the afternoon breeze. Seagulls circled overhead. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like standing in the middle of a trial. I glanced back at the water, then at the dock, then at the group standing on my lawn. Finally, I asked the question that made several of them roll their eyes. Quick question. The HOA president lifted her chin. "Yes? Who told you the lake belongs to the HOA?" That got a few scoffs. The tall guy in the golf shirt laughed. "Everyone knows that." The dog lady added, "It's common property." The HOA president tapped her clipboard again. "It's been this way for years." She started walking back toward the driveway, clearly done with the conversation. 48 hours, Mr. Hale." The neighbors began turning too, muttering about new people and respecting community rules. But then she stopped, turned back, and delivered one final warning. "If that dock is still standing after Friday," she said coldly, "we'll have contractors here to tear it down." The group started leaving. SUV doors slammed. Engines started. Within minutes, the entire little parade of HOA authority disappeared down the road. Just like that, silence returned to the lake. The water lapped gently against the dock posts. I stood there for a moment watching the ripples. Then I walked out to the end of the dock. The wood creaked under my feet. I looked across the water toward the far shoreline, where dozens of neat little docks stretched out from the neighboring houses like wooden fingers reaching into the lake. All identical. All owned by people who apparently believed the water belonged to them. I leaned down and brushed my hand across the lake's surface. Cold, clear, quiet. And that's when I started laughing. Because those 9 angry neighbors had just threatened a one person in Pine Harbor they absolutely should not have threatened. They thought they were protecting their lake. What they didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the docks they used every single day, the docks they parked their boats on, the docks they were so proud of, technically, legally, every single one of them was sitting on shoreline easements controlled by my property. And if they really wanted to start a fight over this lake, they were about to learn exactly who actually controlled access to it. The strange thing is, when I first moved to the lake, it felt like I had finally found peace. No noise, no traffic, no city chaos, just water, trees, and the sound of wind moving through the reeds along the shoreline. After 15 years of living in cramped apartments and working 12-hour shifts in a noisy warehouse, the little lake house felt almost unreal. The place wasn't fancy. In fact, the realtor had called it a fixer-upper with character, which was a polite way of saying the house was old enough to remember dial-up internet. But the moment I stepped onto the back porch and saw the lake stretching out in front of me, I didn't care. The water looked like glass that morning. Perfectly still. A thin layer of mist floated across the surface, and a pair of ducks cut through it like tiny boats. I remember thinking something simple. This is it. A quiet place. A fresh start. The house itself sat on a gentle slope down to the shoreline. A line of tall oak trees framed the property, giving it a little privacy from the other homes scattered around the lake. And of course, there was the dock. The same dock the HOA president had just threatened to tear down. It stretched straight out from the shore, sturdy cedar planks supported by thick posts that disappeared into the water. Someone had built it years ago, maybe even decades. It wasn't fancy. No boat lift, no covered platform, just a solid wooden dock with a ladder and a small bench at the end. But to me, it was perfect. The first night after I moved in, I sat out there with a cheap folding chair and watched the sunset. Orange light spilled across the water. The lake slowly turned gold, then purple, then black. I remember thinking how quiet everything was. The kind of quiet you don't get in cities. No sirens, no neighbors blasting music. Just crickets and the soft sound of water moving against the dock. But even that first night, something felt a little strange. Across the lake, I could see houses lining the opposite shoreline. Big houses, much bigger than mine. 2-story homes with manicured lawns, fancy patios, and expensive-looking boats tied up to long, white docks. Every house seemed to have one. Row after row of identical docks stretching into the water, and every once in a while I'd notice someone standing out on one of them, watching. Not openly staring, just glancing over, then disappearing inside. At first I didn't think much of it. Small communities tend to be curious when someone new moves in, especially somewhere quiet like a lake neighborhood. But the next morning I noticed something else. Around 7 a.m., while I was unloading boxes from the truck, a boat passed slowly in front of my dock, not speeding by. Just drifting. 2 people sat inside it, a man and a woman wearing sunglasses. They weren't fishing, they weren't swimming, they were looking directly at my house. When they realized I noticed them, the man quickly started the motor and the boat moved on. That was odd, but it got stranger later that afternoon. I was inside assembling a bookshelf when I heard tires crunching on gravel. I walked to the window and saw an SUV slow down at the end of my driveway. It didn't pull in, just stopped. The driver leaned forward, clearly trying to get a better look at the house. Then the SUV drove away. 10 minutes later, another car did the same thing, and another. By evening, I'd seen at least 5 different vehicles slow down outside the property. None of them stopped long enough to talk. None of them knocked on the door. They just looked, like they were inspecting something. Or maybe inspecting me. That night I walked down to the dock again, trying to shake the feeling that I had somehow stepped into the middle of something I didn't understand yet. The lake was quiet again, but this time I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. Every single house around the lake had lights pointed toward the water. Bright white dock lights reflecting across the surface. Dozens of them, like a glowing ring surrounding the lake. And right in the middle of that ring was my dock, the only one that looked different. Old cedar wood instead of polished white boards. No lights, no boat, just a simple structure sitting quietly in the dark water. That's when I realized something. All the other docks looked the same design, same layout, like they had been built by the same developer, except mine. Mine looked older, different, like it had been there long before the others were built. I didn't think much about it at the time. Honestly, I was more focused on fixing the leaking kitchen sink and figuring out why the back door stuck whenever the humidity went up. But looking back now, that little difference was the first clue. Because what I didn't know yet, what none of those curious neighbors driving past my house seemed to realize, was that the quiet little dock everyone kept staring at was connected to a piece of property history that was about to turn the entire lake community upside down. 3 days after that awkward meeting with the HOA president, I woke up to something sitting in my mailbox that made my stomach drop. Not bills, not a welcome letter, an official notice from the HOA board. And the title at the top was so absurd, I actually laughed the first time I read it. Notice of authorized private control of community water access. Yeah, they were accusing me of illegally controlling the lake, the same lake that was literally listed on my property deed. But the deeper I read into the letter, the more unbelievable it became. Because they weren't just accusing me, they were demanding something. And that demand would trigger the biggest mistake the HOA would make in this entire story. The letter was 3 pages long, typed, stamped, signed by the HOA president. It started with a lot of legal-sounding nonsense about community assets, shared resources, and neighborhood access rights. But the real message was buried halfway down the page. They were claiming that the lake behind my house was historically used by the community, and therefore should remain accessible to all HOA members. Now, that might sound reasonable at first, but here's the problem. The lake wasn't community property. It had never been community property. It wasn't listed in the HOA documents. It wasn't listed as shared land. And according to the county property map, the entire lake, including the shoreline and the small marina, sat squarely inside my property boundary. But apparently the HOA had a different idea, because at the bottom of the letter was their solution. They demanded that I sign an agreement granting permanent community access to the lake and the docks, and if I refused, they would pursue legal action to restore historical community access. I sat there in my kitchen rereading that line about 5 times, not because it scared me, but because it made absolutely no sense. You can't restore access to land that was never yours to begin with. Still, I figured maybe this was just a misunderstanding. So I called the number on the letter. The HOA president answered, and she sounded very confident. Before I could even explain anything, she launched straight into a speech. "Oh, good, you got the notice," she said. "We need that sign by the end of the week so the community can keep using the lake." I told her calmly that the lake was part of my private property. There was a long pause. Then she laughed. Not a friendly laugh, more like the kind of laugh someone gives when they think you're being ridiculous. "Oh, honey," she said, "That lake has belonged to the neighborhood for over 20 years." That's when I realized something important. She wasn't lying. She genuinely believed that, which meant one of two things was happening. Either the HOA had been operating under a huge misunderstanding for decades, or someone had been using my land without permission for years. I told her I'd review the documents and get back to her. She didn't like that answer. Her tone changed immediately. "You have until Friday," she said. "Otherwise the board will escalate this." Escalate. That word stuck with me, because they clearly thought they had the upper hand. But what they didn't know was that I had already reviewed my property documents very carefully before buying the house. And there was one specific detail they clearly hadn't noticed. A detail that would completely change this situation, and it had nothing to do with the lake itself. It had to do with the docks. See, the HOA thought they had been using the docks as part of their community lake access. But what they didn't realize was that those docks weren't just sitting on my land. They were sitting on structures I legally owned and controlled, which meant something very simple. If they tried to force access to the lake, I had the legal right to do something that would completely shut down their entire plan. But I didn't say any of that yet. Instead, I did something much smarter. I emailed the HOA board a single sentence. "Please provide documentation proving the lake is a community asset." And then I waited, because the response they sent back 2 days later would prove just how badly the HOA had misunderstood the situation. And it would set up the moment when they finally realized they had picked a fight with the one person in the neighborhood who actually controlled the docks. 2 days after I asked the HOA for proof that the lake belonged to the community, they finally responded. And judging by the size of the email attachment, they clearly believed they had just won the argument. The file they sent me was labeled Community Lake Access Documentation. Confident, official, final. Except the moment I opened it, I realized something incredible, because the very documents they see, meant to prove the lake was theirs, were about to prove the exact opposite. The email itself was short, almost smug. The HOA president wrote, "Attached are the historical neighborhood plans and documents confirming the lake's community use. As you can see, the lake has always been intended for HOA residents." That word stood out immediately. Intended, not owned, not legally transferred, just intended. Still, I downloaded the attachment. Inside were scanned copies of 3 things. A 1998 neighborhood development map, a brochure from the original property developer, a HOA community guide from 2003. At first glance, it looked convincing. The development map showed the entire neighborhood layout. Houses, roads, walking trails, and right in the center of the map was the lake. And next to the lake was a label that read, "Community Recreation Area." Now, I'll admit, if you didn't know how property law works, that might seem like solid proof. But here's the thing about development maps. They're not legal ownership documents. They're marketing plans. And that brochure they included, it was basically a real estate advertisement from the late 90s. Pictures of smiling families, kids fishing off a dock, couples kayaking at sunset, all under the headline, "Enjoy exclusive lake access." But there was something they clearly hadn't noticed. Because buried in the fine print at the bottom of that same brochure was a single line that changed everything. It said, "Lake access subject to property boundaries and individual lot ownership." I read that line 3 times just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Then I pulled out the official county property map I had saved when I bought the house, and suddenly the entire situation made sense. The original developer had planned for the lake to be a community feature. But at some point during construction, the developer had subdivided the land differently. Instead of keeping the lake under HOA ownership, they had attached it to Lot 17, which just so happened to be the house I'd bought, meaning the HOA had spent the last 20 years believing the lake was theirs. when legally it had been private property the entire time. But the most unbelievable part wasn't the lake, it was the docks. Because those docks weren't mentioned anywhere in the HOA documents. Not once. Not in the community guide. Not in the development map. Not even in the development map. Not even in the brochure photos. And that meant something important. The docks had been built after the neighborhood was finished, which meant someone, probably the previous homeowner, had installed them privately. And when I checked my property records again, there it was, clear as day. Dock structures, privately owned improvements under Lot 17. That's when I leaned back in my chair and actually laughed. Because the HOA had just sent me the exact documents that proved two things. They never legally owned the lake. They had no claim whatsoever to the docks. But here's the crazy part. Despite all that evidence, they still believed they were right. Because at the bottom of the email, the HOA president added one more sentence. Please sign the access agreement by Friday, so residents can continue using the lake and docks. I stared at that sentence for a long moment. They hadn't realized it yet, but by demanding that agreement, they had just admitted something very important. They knew they didn't legally control the lake. Otherwise, they wouldn't need my permission. And if they needed permission, that meant I had something they desperately wanted. Control, not just of the lake, but of every single dock their boats were tied to. And that's when I decided something. Up until that moment, I had been trying to resolve the situation politely. But after reading that email, I realized the HOA wasn't going to stop. So instead of arguing with them, I sent a very simple reply, just 3 sentences. Thank you for the documents. After reviewing them, I confirm the lake and docks are part of my private property. Therefore, all unauthorized dock use must stop immediately. And the moment I hit send, I had a feeling the next HOA meeting was about to become very interesting. Because what they did next would force me to make a decision that would completely change the power dynamic in the neighborhood. And it all started when I walked outside the next morning and saw something sitting at the end of my dock that absolutely shouldn't have been there. The morning after, I told the HOA that the docks were private property. I walked outside with a cup of coffee, expecting a quiet lake view. Instead, I froze halfway down my porch steps, because tied to the end of my dock was a boat I had never seen before, and sitting inside it was a man fishing like he owned the place. That was the moment I realized something. The HOA hadn't just ignored my warning, they had decided to challenge it, and what happened next would turn a neighborhood dispute into a full-blown showdown. The lake was calm that morning. The sun was just coming up over the trees, and the water looked like glass. Normally, it would have been the perfect peaceful moment. But that strange boat sitting on my dock ruined the whole picture. It wasn't small either. It was a full fishing boat with a trolling motor, cooler, and 2 rods set up. Whoever owned it clearly planned to stay for a while. I walked down the path toward the dock. The man looked up when he heard my footsteps. He gave me a friendly nod. "Morning," he said casually. Like this was completely normal. I stopped at the edge of the dock and asked the obvious question. "Is this your boat?" He smiled. "Yep." Then he added something that immediately told me what was going on. HOA said the lake's open to residents. There it was. The HOA had already started telling people to keep using the docks, which meant they were deliberately ignoring my email. I took a breath and tried to keep things calm. "I'm sorry," I told him, "but the docks are part of my private property." The fisherman looked confused. He glanced around the lake like he expected someone else to explain the situation. Then he shrugged. "Well, the board told us we could use them." And honestly, I believed him. He didn't look like someone trying to cause trouble. He looked like someone who had been told the lake was a community feature for years, which apparently it had been, just without the legal part. So I explained the situation. I told him about the property lines, the documents, the fact that the docks belonged to the lot I had just purchased. And slowly, his expression changed. "Wait," he said, "so this dock is actually yours?" "Legally, yes." He looked back at his boat, then back at the house, and finally said something that made me realize how deep the HOA's misunderstanding had gone. "We've been using these docks for like 20 years. 20 years. That meant multiple homeowners before me had probably just never enforced the property line. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they didn't notice. Or maybe they didn't want to fight the HOA. But now the situation had changed, because unlike the previous owner, I had already been threatened with legal action, and that meant I couldn't just ignore the issue anymore. The fisherman sighed and started pulling in his line. "Man, the board didn't say anything about this." "I figured they wouldn't," I said. He untied his boat and pushed away from the dock. "But before leaving," he said something interesting. "You might want to talk to them again," he said, "because they told everyone lake access was staying open." That word again, everyone. And that's when I realized something potentially disastrous. If the HOA had told the entire neighborhood that the lake was open, then this wasn't just about one fisherman. At any moment, multiple boats could start showing up. Families, kayaks, jet skis, dozens of people using my docks. And if that happened, the situation could spiral out of control fast. So I did something simple, but very deliberate. I walked back up to the house, opened my laptop, and printed out 3 copies of the property survey. Then I grabbed a few wooden stakes from the garage. An hour later, anyone approaching the lake from the neighborhood trail saw something new. Signs posted clearly at the edge of the shoreline. PR Evade Property. Dock Access Restrite. And right below it, a copy of the official county map showing the property boundary. I wasn't trying to start a war, I was just making the facts visible. But apparently, the HOA took that personally, because later that afternoon, 3 members of the HOA board showed up at my driveway, including the president, and judging by the look on her face, she was absolutely furious. What she said next would push the situation further than I expected, because instead of trying to solve the problem, she made a threat that forced me to consider something drastic, something that would completely change the HOA's relationship with the lake forever. And it all started with a single sentence she shouted the moment she stepped out of her car. "You can't block a community property." When the HOA president stepped out of her car and shouted, "You can't block community property," I almost laughed. Not because the situation was funny, but because at that exact moment, she still had no idea how wrong she was. And what happened during the next 10 minutes would completely flip the power dynamic between me and the entire HOA. The HOA president marched up my driveway like she was leading an investigation. Behind her were 2 other board members. All 3 of them looked angry, but the president looked furious. She pointed straight toward the lake. "I saw the signs you posted," she said sharply. "You cannot block residents from using the lake." I stayed calm. "Actually," I replied, "I can, because it's private property." She immediately shook her head. "No, it's not." Then she said something that made the entire situation even more unbelievable. "This lake has been part of the community for over 20 years. I nodded. "I know people have been using it, but that doesn't make it HOA property." She crossed her arms. "You're misunderstanding the neighborhood agreement." That was the moment I decided to stop debating. Instead, I walked back into the house. For a few seconds, the board members stood in awkward silence in my driveway. When I came back out, I was holding a folder. Inside it were the same documents I had already sent them: the county property map, the deed, and the improvement record for the docks. I handed the map to the president. "This is the official property survey," I said. She barely glanced at it. "I've already seen that." "Then you should look again." She unfolded the map fully. And for the first time since she arrived, her confidence started to fade, because the property line was clearly marked, right through the lake, with the entire shoreline surrounding my house inside Lot 17. One of the other board members leaned closer. "Wait, the lake is inside his lot." The president frowned. "That can't be right." So I showed them the deed, then the county record, then the dock registration. Every single document said the same thing. The lake and docks were part of my property, not HOA land, not shared community space, private property. For about 10 seconds, nobody said anything. Then one of the board members asked the obvious question. If that's true, how have residents been using the docks for years? And honestly, that was the best question anyone had asked the entire time, because the answer was surprisingly simple. The previous owner allowed it. The president immediately shook her head again. "No, that's not possible." "Why not?" "Because we've always told residents the lake belonged to the HOA. Exactly. That was the real problem. At some point in the past, someone on the HOA board had made an assumption, and that assumption had slowly turned into a belief. Then that belief turned into a rule. And after 20 years, the entire neighborhood treated the lake like community property, even though legally it never was. The president looked frustrated now. "This is ridiculous," she said. "Even if the lake is technically part of your lot, residents have a right to use it." I raised an eyebrow. "Based on what?" She hesitated, then said something that completely gave away the situation. "Because they always have, and there it was. Not a law, not a contract, just tradition." Which meant something very important. The HOA didn't actually have the authority they thought they did. And once they realized that, the conversation changed fast. One of the board members turned to the president. "Maybe we should have a lawyer review this." She clearly didn't like that suggestion, but she also didn't have an argument anymore. So she pointed toward the lake one last time. "We're not done with this," she said. Then they got back into their cars and drove away. But something about that interaction stuck with me, because while the HOA president had lost the argument, she didn't look like someone who planned to give up. Which meant this situation wasn't over. Not even close. In fact, later that week, I received a letter that proved the HOA was preparing their last move. And when I read what they were trying to do, I realized I had two choices. I could keep fighting them every time someone showed up at the lake, or I could make one decision that would settle the entire dispute permanently. A decision involving the docks that the HOA definitely wasn't expecting. And once it happened, the neighborhood would never look at that lake the same way again. A week after the HOA stormed out of my driveway, I received one more letter from them. But this one wasn't a demand. It was a warning, and reading it made something very clear. The HOA wasn't planning to back down. They were preparing to drag this entire situation into a legal fight. And that's when I realized something important. If I kept reacting to them, this could drag on for months, maybe even years. But there was another option. One decision, one move, something completely legal that would end the entire dispute instantly. And the crazy part, the HOA had accidentally given me the perfect reason to do it. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon. It was from the HOA's attorney, and unlike the previous emails, this one sounded much more serious. It claimed the community had established historical usage rights to the lake and docks. They were basically arguing that because residents had used the lake for so long, they should continue being allowed to use it. Now, legally, that argument wasn't very strong, but it told me something important. The HOA was preparing for a long fight. Meetings, lawyers, endless arguments, and honestly, I had zero interest in turning my new home into a courtroom battlefield. So instead of responding immediately, I sat down and thought about the one thing the HOA actually cared about. It wasn't the lake itself. It was the docks. The docks were the only practical way for residents to launch boats, fish comfortably, or tie up kayaks. Without the docks, the lake would still exist. but it wouldn't be nearly as useful to the neighborhood. And that's when the idea hit me. A simple solution, one that followed every property law perfectly, and one the HOA could do absolutely nothing about. The next morning, I called a contractor. He came out to inspect the dock structures. After walking around for a few minutes, he asked the obvious question, "Are you looking to repair them?" I shook my head. "No, I'm thinking about removing them." He raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" "Yup." And that's when the reality of the situation finally became clear. Because those docks weren't permanent. They were modular floating docks, meaning they could be disconnected and removed without touching the lake itself. Which meant something very simple. If the docks were gone, no one could use them. And since they were privately owned structures, I had every legal right to remove them. So that's exactly what I decided to do. A week later, a small crew arrived with a flatbed truck. They started disconnecting the floating sections one by one. It didn't take long before word spread around the neighborhood. By mid-morning, a few curious residents were standing near the shoreline watching. Then something even more predictable happened. The HOA president showed up. Again, she walked straight toward the lake with the same frustrated expression I'd seen before. But this time, she looked more confused than angry. "What are they doing?" she demanded. I gave a calm answer, removing my docks. Her eyes widened. "You can't do that." "Actually," I said, "I can. They're private structures on my property." She looked out at the workers loading the dock sections onto the truck. One by one, the pieces disappeared. The long walkway, the fishing platform, the boat tie-off posts. Within a couple of hours, the entire dock system was gone. Just open water remained, and suddenly the HOA's entire argument collapsed. Because they could claim community access all they wanted. But access to what? There was nowhere to stand, nowhere to tie boats, nowhere to fish comfortably, just shoreline and water. The president looked completely stunned. "You did this on purpose," she said. I shrugged. "You were threatening legal action over something you believed belonged to the HOA. So I removed the problem." For the first time since this whole situation started, she didn't have a response. And that was the moment I realized the fight was finally over. Because the HOA had spent weeks trying to force control over something they thought was theirs. But the moment the docks disappeared, their leverage disappeared too. No docks, no argument, no lawsuit worth pursuing. Eventually the president turned around and walked back to her car. The remaining residents slowly drifted away, and by sunset, the lake was completely quiet again. Just water, trees, and a peaceful view from my backyard. Ironically, once the docks were gone, the HOA never contacted me again about the lake. No more letters, no more meetings. Because the truth had finally sunk in. They had tried to control something that was never theirs to control. And in the end, their own pressure had pushed me to make the one decision that removed their access forever. Which means the biggest lesson from this entire story is pretty simple. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to remove the thing people are fighting over.